Is this the year where PECOTA finally doesn't hate the St. Louis Cardinals? Coming up on B Shave Daily. What's going on, everybody, and welcome in to this edition of B Shave Daily. Brenden Schaeffer. It is Thursday, February 8th, 2024. We are just a matter of days away from the opening to spring training. Pitchers and catchers reporting a few days from right now at this moment. I'm excited to get down to Jupiter, Florida myself, taking off on the road again Monday morning. What's that, the 12th? February 12th, I think is Monday, because Saturday's the 10th, 11th, 12th. February 12th, I'll be taking off. I'll probably get there Tuesday afternoon. So Wednesday might be my first morning on the campus at Roger Dean Stadium down there in Jupiter. Can't wait to cover spring training this year for CAMOV. All my articles at firstalert4.com. Stay tuned for that. And for, of course, a lot of coverage here on B Shave Daily, the YouTube channel, Brenden Schaeffer, St. Louis Cardinals writer. I think this is just for housekeeping purposes, but I think that first podcast from Jupiter every year is when I sort of, on the Spotify app, as I catalog these episodes, I call it season whatever. It's a new season of B Shave Daily. I officially start that day one whenever I get to spring training. So I think this will be season 4 for the podcast. And this year, hopefully, we will record more episodes than any year previous. It's always been more and more work that we've been doing. And now with YouTube, I feel compelled to really try and give you guys the most comprehensive coverage possible. So hit subscribe on the channel if you like daily Cardinals coverage. That's what you'll get from me in 2024 as we wind down season 3 of B Shave Daily. Like I said, I don't know if that's even out there anywhere, if you can see that publicly, or if that's just on my cataloging side, what I describe as the season. We recently had episode number 500. I didn't make fanfare about that, but I'll try and, when we get to 1,000 episodes, I'll try to at least mention it within the episode. That won't be this year, probably 2025. Hopefully, if we can crank out maybe 200 and something of these per year, then we'll be good to go. But today on the show, I want to talk briefly about PECOTA, because the Cardinals, for a number of years, when the first edition of the PECOTA projections come out every year, and it stands for something, Player Empirical Comparison and Optimization Test Algorithm. Yeah, no wonder they call it PECOTA. That's ridiculous. A sabermetric system for forecasting Major League Baseball player performance. I read that straight off of Wikipedia, just so you know. But it's a good, system, one of these systems where Baseball Prospectus, they put out the PECOTA projections every year. And I think these actually morph and change during the season, because you could look at it in June and it's going to say something different because it's constantly updating based on the data, the teams, and how they're doing, etc. But for the years and years that we have been doing this show, the Cardinals are always, almost always, sort of written off by PECOTA before the year. And it becomes like an annual rite of spring where we dig in early February and say, oh my gosh, PECOTA thinks the Cardinals are going to win 78 games. They hate the Cardinals again. Which, of course, when we say they, it's a projection system. It's not any individual that says, I don't like the Cardinals, so I'm going to predict they'll lose more games, whatever. But for years, it would seem like PECOTA would, like clockwork, come in with a very low projection, and the Cardinals for years would exceed that projection. Now, last year, Cardinals won 71 games. So they fell below their PECOTA expectation, which I actually don't think was too bad last year. They were giving the Cardinals, obviously, more credit than they ultimately wound up deserving, but I think it was in the mid-80s, maybe even upper 80s on PECOTA for the Cardinals preseason 2023. Let's talk about the PECOTA projections that are now out. BaseballProspectus.com/standings is exactly where I'm reading these from as of this moment. And speaking of these different projection systems, I want to make sure to make a correction on some of our previous episodes when we were talking about the ZiPS projections. I was attributing that to Fangraphs, which is not exactly right. I was reading the ZiPS projections off of Fangraphs for the individual Cardinals players, position players, and pitchers. We kind of had a couple episodes recently going over those and what ZiPS thinks about the Cardinals moving into the new season. But the correction I wanted to issue was on behalf of the folks that put together ZiPS, because it's not Fangraphs. Fangraphs will host the information, but it's Dan Szymborski who came up with the system in large part, and cohorts that are responsible for ZiPS. And so I want to make sure to give proper credit there. I hope I'm not doing the same thing with PECOTA. I think that's Baseball Prospectus. But if I am doing it wrong, somebody make sure to email me and I'll correct the attribution on that. But PECOTA, let's dig into what they say about the Cardinals and the rest of the NL Central heading into 2024. I think it's rather interesting that PECOTA actually has the Cardinals slated to win the division, and by a pretty healthy margin. As of the 8th of February, as we're reading this today, the Cardinals are projected, according to PECOTA, for 85.2 wins. 85.2, most in the NL Central. Second place, second most on these projections is the Cubs at 80.4. So a below 500 expectation for the second place team in the vaunted NL Central. Milwaukee at 79, Cincinnati at 78.4, and Pittsburgh bringing up the caboose at 72.6, which is, of course, more wins than the Cardinals had last year as the caboose of the division at 71. Is that interesting or what? I know we've had a lot of conversation about, did the Cardinals actually get better? I talked with Charlie Marlowe on our podcast, Low Hanging Fruit, Thursday afternoon. I think he'll be releasing that either Thursday night or Friday morning, so stay tuned to Charlie's channel for that conversation. But we got into it a little bit, the notion of, did the Cardinals actually improve the roster compared to what they had last year? And I think the answer is yes. And I think you can look at the rotation and say the moves that were made stabilized the group on paper. Now, injuries can always happen. I think they happened to the Cardinals last year in certain regards, and some of the guys that they were maybe counting on that didn't play a full season, it hurt the team from an overall win total perspective. This year, though, I think when you look at the rotation, the guys they brought in, they're hoping it's going to be a more durable group. I don't know that there's a certainty of that happening. Like, that's where the bottom could ultimately fall out on this thing. Think about Sonny Gray, Lance Lynn, Kyle Gibson. We say, oh, these guys are they're just rock solid. They'll give you 170, 180, 190 innings, and that's going to raise the collective floor of the St. Louis Cardinals in 2024, because last year you just didn't have those types of starting pitchers at the back end of your rotation. Adam Wainwright was bad, historically bad, and he didn't get deep into games very often, which put more of a toll on your bullpen. And so the buck was kind of passed on to that group, and it made their performance lesser on the whole. And then you have guys get injured. Obviously, you trade away two key pieces at the deadline in Flaherty and Montgomery. I talk about the rotation. Stratton and Hicks went during that deadline as well. But from the rotation, you trade away two mainstays, and the way they tried to backfill that with Hudson and Drew Rom and guys like Jake Woodford, it just didn't end up panning out very well. Now, if you need to backfill this year, I do think there are going to be questions about whether or not the Cardinals are actually in a better footing when it comes to their rotation depth behind the first five. I think the first five are better. I don't think that's even really, again, on paper, I don't think that's even debatable. Sonny Gray versus, and we'll talk about the rotation as it was at its peak last year when Jordan Montgomery and Jack Flaherty were in it. But doing so, you recognize that those guys weren't part of the team the last 2 months. So it's not entirely a fair comparison. Like, this year automatically gains an edge over last year's rotation, knowing that, well, you're probably not trading away guys from this year's group at the deadline unless you're out of it again, in which case, everybody will be able to say we were right. They weren't any better. But if you go Sonny Gray versus Jordan Montgomery, I'm not going to give the edge to either party. Gray had a little bit of better numbers last year, but then Monty pitched so well in the playoffs that I think his star is rising a little bit, and we'll see what Gray is able to replicate this year. So I'll call that a wash, with the caveat being that the Cardinals will now have Gray for a full season, and they only had Montgomery for 4 months before trading him away last year. So comparing the 71 win total to how do you get PECOTA to 85 wins, which is around where I think the Cardinals are, honestly. I'm looking at this PECOTA projection. I think it's pretty fair. Some people will probably say it's too lofty because they didn't make enough bold moves in the offseason. Some people might say it's not high enough because maybe they're really high on the moves the Cardinals made. Everybody's going to have their own opinion. But when I look at the jump from 71 to 85, I think it becomes more plausible when you break it down. All right, Gray to Montgomery to Gray, rather. I'm going to call it an even split, but you're gaining on Gray because you get 2 more months of him if you're just trying to have a simulated projection of the season. So that's a spot where I think the Cardinals have at least replaced their best pitcher from last year, and they're going to keep him the whole way through, we think. I don't see any way you're trading Sonny Gray in July. You maybe trade Lance Lynn, Kyle Gibson if they're pitching well enough to have value, and the Cardinals are out of it. Those contracts are set up to be movable. But let's just go under the assumption that the Cardinals are clawing their way toward 85 wins, and so they're not going to be deadline sellers again. Number 2 in the rotation, I mean, Michaelis is still Michaelis. Can he be better than he was? Yeah, it's going to be tough for him to be much worse than he was unless he's hurt. By that, I just mean not that he was awful last year, which he didn't pitch well. The ERA was high, but he gives you 200 innings. I think there's something to be said for that. I also think that if you have a better defense behind him, Miles Michaelis' numbers will be better because I think he's a pitcher that's reliant upon good defense behind him. The years where he was at his best with the Cardinals, you can correlate that to having some pretty strong defensive players behind him, Gold Glove caliber players, and things like that. So for Michaelis, I think whatever. If you don't want to look at it optimistically that he'll be better, you don't have to. Let's just say, okay, Michaelis is still Michaelis. No gains were made. All right, so right now we're through 2 spots, and you say, yeah, no gains were really made significantly over last year's rotation, and I think that's fair. Steven Matz, what's he going to be? Steven Matz, he's back in the rotation the way we pencil it out right now. So again, let's just go ahead and say even Steven on that. But when you replace Adam Wainwright with the way I'm going to look to frame it is Kyle Gibson, because I think Wainwright was your 5 last year in the way that he performed, and Kyle Gibson I expect to be your number 5 this year. I think Kyle Gibson much more reliable in terms of what you can just expect to get from him. You don't expect to get a 7.5 ERA from him. You didn't expect that from Wainwright, but it is what happened. Kyle Gibson, though, I think he'll be like a 4.5, 4.75, maybe even a 5.0 ERA. But if he can give you a 4.9 ERA, which is not glamorous, but if he gives you that over 170 innings, that would be an improvement over what they got from Adam Wainwright. There's no doubt. And then the other spot that I think could be interesting, Lance Lynn versus Jack Flaherty, I think is an interesting comparison because both had volatile seasons. Lance Lynn gave up a bunch of homers. Jack Flaherty walked a bunch of guys, gave up some homers. The numbers overall for Flaherty weren't terrible. I think he had an ERA in the 4s. Lance Lynn, though, I expect to have a better ERA than he did last year and probably a better one than Flaherty gave to the Cardinals last year as well. Like, I think I'm higher on the Lance Lynn signing the more that I think about it. Flaherty with the Cardinals last year, 4.43 ERA. I'll give you a 4.1, 4.2 from Lance Lynn, and I think the innings will be more reliable. Jack Flaherty had some games where, yeah, he got blown up early, left the game early. Maybe that happens to Lance Lynn sometimes too. But I do think there is an improvement that was made because of the reliability of the innings. And Jack Flaherty, over the course of his career since 2019, hasn't pitched more than 144 innings. And that's what he gave last year between the Cardinals and the Orioles. I think Lance Lynn, he's going to take the ball. That's the line that Mozeliak has continued to use. Well, these guys take the ball. So if Lance Lynn gives you 170, 180, Kyle Gibson maybe does the same. Like, that's what the Cardinals are reliant upon in this notion that they got better. And I think you can, with the descriptions of kind of lining up 1 through 5, I think especially with the Wainwright one, you can look at that and say the Cardinals maybe got 4 or 5 wins better. I don't know if that's too generous of a way to frame it, but I do think with how poorly his season went last year and that Kyle Gibson is going to be sturdy at number 5. But this is assuming no injuries and that these guys are sturdy and rock solid. But if you look at their careers too, they've had years where they have pitched injured or haven't pitched because of injury. Kyle Gibson has been pretty reliable in terms of his innings load in recent years. I'll pull that up right now. 167 in 2022, 192 this past season, 182 in 2021, 67 innings in the COVID year, which is whatever. That's probably about standard. 160, 196, 158, 147, 194, Like, he's always been a guy that's taken the ball 30 times a year. He's really not had that missed year to injury. And now he's older, so maybe you'd fear that it would come this year. But I think that's, like, he's going to be more reliable, I feel like, more durable than what Adam Wainwright certainly was. And the durability of Lance Lynn, like, he's had some years where he was injured, but as long as Michaelis is hurt sometimes too, right? He had the year and a half where he basically didn't pitch, Miles Michaelis. But Lance Lynn, by and large, has been a guy that has been workhorse. 2019, over 200 innings. 2020, he led the league in innings with 84. Granted, that was over a shorter season, so they kind of figured they could push him and he could handle it, and he had a great year in the COVID year. 2021, 157 innings. 2022 dealt with some injuries, I suppose. Only 21 starts, 121 innings for the White Sox. Last year, 183. I think when you look at guys like Gibson and Lynn, Sonny Gray, we won't go through his innings, but he's had some years where he's kind of pitched through some injuries, but largely a workhorse that's going to take the ball. Like, that's the type of guys that the Cardinals got. And so the bet is, like, the gamble is that you're not going to rely upon the Hudson, Rom, Woodford. I don't know why I keep forgetting Woodford's name. You're not going to rely on that class of pitcher as much to fill in. That's the gamble. If you do need guys 6, 7, 8, and 9 throughout the year to make a bunch of starts, I don't know. I think it's a fair criticism that I don't know that the Cardinals are in a much better position than they were last year, other than to say that it's kind of going to be put up or shut up time for guys like Gordon Graceffo, Michael McGreevy. Not to say their careers will be over, but like if the Cardinals are going to be able to rely upon those depth starters, this is the year where they have to show up to spring, be ready to make that leap. Zach Thompson goes in that bucket. Matthew Liberatore, if they use him as a starter, goes in that bucket. Like, that's what it could boil down to. Does that make you feel great as a Cardinals fan? It might not. You might not feel like that's a great plan because they just had that plan in some form or fashion last year, and instead of using those guys or even giving them a sniff at the big leagues, they said, well, Dakota, come on down because you're on the 40-man and, you know, the season's kind of over anyway. Like, was that part of it? Was it the fact that Gordon Graceffo and McGreevy and those types of guys didn't advance enough? And now you can add guys like Sem Robertson and Adam Kloffenstein that they picked up at the deadline. Is it that those guys just didn't advance enough in the progression of their careers during the 2023 minor league season? Or the Cardinals knew like their year was toast anyway by then, and so they're not going to try and force anything with people that are prospect caliber. And so that's why it ended up being Woodford and Hudson and Rom, who like could be prospect caliber, but I think they kind of figured he was behind the pecking order a little bit, but he was a guy they could throw to the wolves a little bit. That's not a fair way to look at Drew Rom's career, and he probably is going to take everything that he can to soak up from those experiences and make himself more of a factor for 24 than we're now talking about him to be. But I think that's maybe the way the Cardinals viewed it too. They won't have the luxury this time. If injuries happen, it's you, Zach Thompson. Like you've got to be ready for that moment. And if you're not, it's you, Graceffo. It's you, McGreevy. They're going to have to get some sort of production from that grouping. If the plan A of just have starters who don't get hurt, if that plan ends up being a bit foolhardy, I think that's where the Cardinals are really going to be tested in terms of the depth. And to the people who would say, well, then why didn't they sign another starter? I get it, but who are you displacing? Probably Steven Matz, but you're paying him $11 million. And is that the route the Cardinals want to go? And can they even convince a free agent starter to sign here when they look down and see that there are 5 starters already sort of allocated for those spots? The Blake Snell tier and the Montgomery tier, it sounds great in theory, but I don't think like those guys sign somewhere and they know they're getting a rotation spot. So this doesn't really apply to them. But like, could the Cardinals go in on that market where they do pay somebody $10 million or $20 million over 2 years to be kind of the swing man as some added proven depth? You could go that route, but I think it just gets messier and more complicated. The way they've built their rotation this year is like, we don't want to rely upon the young guys out of the gate because that would be a little bit dangerous. They might not be ready for it. But we also acknowledge that at some point we're going to have to rely upon this internal pitching depth rather than sign mediocre guys that we're going to overpay for in the free agent market to be our emergency landing chute. Like you have to eventually get some productivity out of the internal options that you have been telling us for years are prospects, and you're spending first round picks on these guys. Like that's going to be where the rubber meets the road, I think, on the 24 season from a pitching perspective. Hitting wise, so if in the bullpen too, by the way, I think it's going to be a little bit better by virtue of if plan A works and guys go 6 innings, the bullpen doesn't have to work as hard. And so those innings are more, you're sharper for those innings and you're not overworked when the dog days arrive. Like that's fine in theory. We'll see if it pans out that way. Talent wise, I think the bullpen did get a little bit better, because you had guys like Keenan Middleton and Andrew Kittredge who are proven to an extent that they've been around the block. They're experienced in those late innings, in those leverage innings, and you can add those to guys like Jojo Romero, to Ryan Helsley, to Gio Gallegos, and you kind of have a good stable in that bullpen. So I'm going to say let's look at it a little bit optimistically and say it does work out that your starters stay moderately healthy, and that's the group of guys that get you 6-7 innings more often than not. Therefore, the bullpen with a little bit of a talent advantage over last year's team and hopefully a workload advantage. Let's say you gain a couple of wins there as well. So what? 4 wins in the rotation, 2 in the bullpen. You're up to 6. Now you're at 77. Can you squint a little bit and see the idea that, hey, they were just so bad last year that the vibes were bad? How many wins is vibes worth? Probably a few. All right, we're to 80, 81. Does the offense get better than it was last year? And I think it's most fair to look at the offense as it was on July 31st before the team gave the symbol that we're waving the white flag and then they started just ILing anybody who had a canker sore. Like it was basically, if you stubbed your toe at the end of the year, you're on the IL. And it's not to say those injuries aren't real, but they're the types of injuries that you probably play through if you can, for certain guys, if you're playing for anything of substance. So does the offense get better than it was when it was sitting around, 7th, 8th best in baseball, whether that's OPS or runs scored? Like, they ended up tailing off pretty considerably the last couple of months. I think, though, with the position players they've got back, like if I mocked the lineup that had, I'm just going to go around the diamond, Contreras, Goldschmidt, Brendan Donovan, Arenado, Mason Wynn, left to right in the outfield, Newt Barr, Tommy Edman, Jordan Walker, with Gorman as your mainstay DH, knowing that they're going to mix and match with the DH. It's a pretty good lineup. Mason Wynn's got to be league average. Tommy Edman's got to be league average. Arenado's got to be more locked in. Goldschmidt's got to be a little less hot and cold than he was last year. I think Jordan Walker takes a massive step forward. Again, what he did at 20, 21 years old is really impressive. He's going to get better. I feel pretty confident. I feel most confident about that. Of all the 9 guys, I think Newt Barr and Donovan will continue to give you what they give you. You need him healthy, though. Tommy Edman, again, I say league average. Like, I think if him and Mason Wynn at the bottom are league average, you don't have too many holes in your lineup. Those are the two that you look at and say, I think everybody else is going to be, if you talk about OPS plus, I think they're going to be above 100. Tommy and Mason are the two that you say, can they get to that? And if they can, I think you have a pretty good lineup. I think you've got a decent enough bench. Not sure about the Matt Carpenter productivity. I'm not sure I buy into that being a thing. We'll see. But like Burleson's a nice lefty bat. We'll kind of see how they round it out. Dylan Carlson, I think, is a solid bench bat. I'm a little worried about the idea that he and Tommy Edman are kind of redundant with their plate profile as switch hitters who don't hit right-handed pitching as well. But I think you have a pretty solid, and I also think Ivan Herrera is going to be a factor. You kind of pencil him into the backup catcher role. If he ends up being a factor and forcing his way into the lineup more often, and you can give Wilson some days off his feet and have him DH, you got to find a way to get both Donnie and Gorman in there at the same time. But like, to me, I do think the lineup, just with the maturation of the young guys, Mason, Jordan, Ivan Herrera, and the realization of the veterans like Goldie and Arenado, that, hey, man, we just got to, it's not that we weren't working hard, but we've got to be dedicated to making this thing go this year. I think the lineup gets you to that kind of 82, 83, and then maybe suddenly we look at it and say, well, I guess vibes could be more important, and that's the way you get to 85. I'm curious what Cardinals fans think. Is 85 a fair number for PECOTA, which has in past years really kind of not given the Cardinals very much credit, and this year it's almost like in the opposite direction, coming off their worst year in decades. PECOTA says, hey, Cardinals did enough, and they're going to be fine. I think that to some extent tells you that last year, at least according to the metrics and the projection systems, they look at last year and say, yep, the vibes were bad in the Cardinals clubhouse because that was a collection of talent that played below its capabilities in only winning 71 games. 85.2 is the projection from PECOTA for the 2024 Cardinals. Gives them a 50.2% chance to win the Central, and then another 15% to win a wild card, making it a 65.2% chance of making the playoffs, which is what Cardinals fans want to see. The World Series percentage, not super high, 2.1%. I think that's to win the World Series at 2.1. Yes, that is the percentage. So it's interesting. What else is interesting, though, is within the NL, the Cardinals actually have the 4th highest projection as of right now. It was 3rd highest. Arizona is up to 85.3 as of this recording here. Los Angeles Dodgers, Atlanta Braves, over 100 wins. It's rare to see projections be that bold, but that just tells you those rosters are loaded. Both of them are loaded. The Cardinals, 85.2. You've got basically 9 or 10 teams sit between a projection of 78 and 85 wins in the National League. It's going to be really interesting to see which of those kind of middling teams ends up making their way into this party and trying to crash it as a wild card or better. At least from within the Central, I can see any of the non-Pirates teams winning this division, honestly. And the Pirates could do it. I just don't think they've got enough depth of talent that if anything goes wrong for them, it's probably going to be still a tough year. In terms of like their young players have to take the leap. The pitching staff, you've got guys like Mitch Keller, but I just don't think they quite have enough. The Reds are interesting. At 78.4, they're projected 4th, but they could be the chief challenger to the Cardinals if the Cubs don't spend some money over the next month. Because I could see an upside for Cincinnati that involves their young pitching rotation just kind of taking the leap all at once. Hunter Green, Nick Lodolo, Brandon Williamson. I'm missing some names. Who's the other kid? Graham Ashcraft. There's another one, too. Andrew Abbott is the other one. I should know. I've been trading him in fantasy leagues like all spring. Trading for him, trading him away, just all that. So they've got like 5 or 6 young pitchers that I think could be a factor, and that could give them an upside that other teams don't possess. Cubs are interesting. If Shota Imanaga ends up just assimilating to MLB and doing great, some people are skeptical over what he'll bring. I think he'll be good for Chicago. If he is, that really helps them. But, you know, in other ways, did they get better than they were last year? Probably not. And they lost Bellinger as of yet, haven't re-signed him. Milwaukee, I mean, they would have been the team probably that would have been more interesting to contend with the Cardinals. I like the Rhys Hoskins signing, but they trade Corbin Burns. I mean, that's going to make life really difficult on them. So they're at 79 wins. And you could see them maybe selling at the deadline, too, if it doesn't pan out because of what they did with Burns. But we'll see. A lot of time to get into that a little bit more in depth. But let me know what you think off the top, Cardinals fans. The comments section below here on YouTube. 85.2 wins for the Cardinals. That's almost 5 clear of the projected wins for the second-place Cubs, according to PECOTA. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And what's it feel like for PECOTA to maybe like the Cardinals this season more than you as a Cardinals fan have faith in them? Let me know in the comments below. Look forward to next week as we will get into Jupiter, Florida, and have plenty of coverage from there right here on the YouTube channel and on Be Safe Daily, and, of course, at KMOV for all the articles that are right down there. That's going to do it, though, for this edition of the show. Appreciate you guys, as always, for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Be Safe Daily. Peace.